The sound of hooves pounding against the dry earth echoed through the canyon, accompanied by the desperate cry of a man fighting against nature's fury. Thomas McCabe's heart raced as he urged his horse forward, but the animal stumbled in the torrential river. The rushing water threatened to drag them both under, but McCabe fought with every ounce of strength, finally managing to pull the horse to safety on the opposite bank. His breath came in ragged gasps as he realized how close he'd come to losing everything. He wasn't just fleeing the Apache warriors who had captured him, he was on a desperate mission to find his wife, Maggie, who had disappeared weeks ago, under mysterious circumstances. Captured after a violent skirmish on his farm, McCabe's world had been turned upside down. He had seen the destruction of his life, his home burned to the ground, his family torn apart, and his wife taken in a raid by the very people now holding him captive. The Apaches, with their fierce ways and unyielding honor, had offered him no mercy yet. Despite his pain and bitterness, McCabe knew he couldn't dwell on anger. He had to focus on one singular goal, finding Maggie no matter the cost. Each passing day brought him closer to what he hoped would be the final confrontation, but the path ahead was filled with uncertainties and dangers beyond anything he had ever known. It was in the isolated Apache camp, deep within the rugged mountains, that McCabe first met Apache. The young Apache girl stood before him, her small frame holding an air of quiet defiance. Her dark eyes locked onto his as she gripped a small blade in her hand, poised yet unthreatened. The warriors around her observed, unsure of what to make of the prisoner, but Apache's presence was magnetic, like she held the power of the entire tribe within her gaze. McCabe, tired and beaten, couldn't understand why a child would be placed before him, especially one so seemingly powerful. But there was something about her Han intensity that made him uneasy then. With a calmness that made McCabe's stomach tighten, she spoke, her words as sharp as the blade in her hand. "If you let me stay, I'll show you where your wife is, buried." The words sliced through the air like a knife, and for a moment, McCabe felt as if time had stopped. His mind raced. How did she know? His wife was lost in the vastness of the desert, and the thought that a child of the Apache tribe held the key to her fate seemed impossible. But something in Apache's eyes told him that this was no trick. She knew something he didn't, and the question of how this child could possess such knowledge gnawed at him. Apache's next words cut through McCabe's thoughts. "She's dead, but there's more to her death than you know." McCabe's heart skipped a beat. He had braced himself for this moment, the day when he would learn Maggie's fate, but hearing it from the lips of this child was something he hadn't expected. His mind screamed in denial, but a cold, harsh truth began to settle in. Maggie was gone, but there was something darker behind her death, something that tied her disappearance to forces far greater than McCabe had ever imagined. A revelation left him with more questions than answers, but the mystery she offered seemed like his only chance to find the truth. Thomas McCabe stood in the heart of the Apache camp, his eyes darting from one warrior to the next. The tension in the air was palpable, the scent of smoke and sweat filling his nostrils. He had never felt more vulnerable. Surrounded by men whose gazes pierced through him like arrows, he wondered how he had ended up in this nightmare. The young girl Apache seemed to hold more power than anyone else in the camp, her calm demeanor unsettling to him. McCabe couldn't shake the question that gnawed at him. How could this child know so much about Maggie? Every word from her mouth felt like a trap, a game that he didn't understand. But if there was any chance, even a sliver of one, that she held the key to finding his wife, he couldn't afford to ignore her. His mind wandered back 2 months before, when his world had shattered. Maggie, his beautiful and strong wife, had been taken in a brutal raid. The day the Apaches came to his farm, the sky was dark with smoke, the sun hidden behind the ash that filled the air. He could still hear the screams of his men and the chaos that ensued. The raiders had moved like shadows, swift and relentless, and in the aftermath, McCabe's heart broke as he realized Maggie was gone. He had promised her that he would find her, no matter the cost, no matter the enemy. But in the weeks since the trail had gone cold, and the search seemed hopeless, now, in the midst of his captivity, the possibility that Apache could help him find her felt like a cruel joke. Yet he couldn't ignore it. McCabe clenched his fists, his muscles tensing with anger and frustration. The little Apache girl, no, older than 12, had just made an offer that sent chills down his spine. "If you help me," she said, her voice steady, "I'll tell you everything." Her words hung in the air like a promise and a warning. What could this child possibly want from him in exchange for the knowledge she claimed to possess? McCabe's mind raced. She wasn't just offering information. She was making a dangerous pact. He couldn't trust her. She was one of them. After all, a member of the tribe that had torn his life apart. Yet something in her eyes told him that she wasn't lying. The question now was whether he was willing to make the dangerous choice, to follow her. The camp around him seemed to close in, the warriors' eyes narrowing in suspicion as they watched the exchange. McCabe knew that any wrong move could cost him his life. They would never let him leave if they thought he was planning something, but he couldn't back down now. The image of Maggie's face, her gentle smile, and the way she had looked at him before she was taken flashed before his eyes. He had to know the truth. "Where are we going?" McCabe asked, his voice gruff but determined. Apache's response was simple, yet it sent a shiver down his spine. the mountains. As the two prepared to leave, McCabe's heart hammered in his chest. The warriors reluctantly parted, watching them with wary eyes. Akachita, despite her young age, seemed to carry an authority that Maccabee couldn't quite understand. She moved with a sense of purpose, as if she knew exactly what would happen next. McCabe, however, felt the weight of every step. The mountains loomed in the distance, an imposing presence on the horizon. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. Akacheta led him through the rugged terrain, and with each passing moment, the sense of dread only grew stronger. What could lie ahead? What could possibly explain the deep connection this child had with his wife's fate? McCabe's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hooves in the distance. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. An ambush. The sound of approaching riders grew louder, and McCabe's instincts kicked in. He reached for his rifle, but Akacheta placed a hand on his arm, her expression unreadable. "Wait," she whispered, her voice barely audible. McCabe didn't. What questioned her? He had learned long ago that in situations like this, hesitation could be fatal. But as he looked into her eyes, something told him that she knew exactly what was happening. She wasn't afraid. She had been prepared for this moment. Riders appeared suddenly, emerging from behind the rocky outcrop. McCabe's pulse quickened as he realized they weren't Apache warriors, they were settlers, armed and ready for a fight. They had been tracking him, or perhaps the entire camp, for days. Akacheta's grip tightened on McCabe's arm, and for the first time, he saw a flash of something that resembled fear in her eyes. She had led him into this trap, but why? What was her true purpose? McCabe stood still, his body tensed for action, waiting for the inevitable clash to come. Akacheta spoke again, her voice steady despite the danger. "Don't fight them, McCabe. They won't kill you. But if you make a move, they will never trust you again." McCabe looked at her, conflicted, furious, and confused. Why was she giving him this warning? He had come so far only to be caught in another trap. But then he realized this was all part of a much larger game. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the feeling that his fate was tied to Akacheta's in ways he hadn't yet begun to understand. And in that moment, McCabe knew that his search for Maggie had just taken a darker turn. The mountain loomed ahead, its jagged peaks piercing the sky. McCabe's muscles ached with every step, the rocky terrain offering no mercy as he and Ak climbed higher. The air was thin, and the cold wind sliced through him like a blade. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he refused to stop. Akacheta moved ahead of him with an unsettling grace, as though the mountain was a familiar friend, not an unforgiving adversary. The further they climbed, the more the tension between them grew. McCabe had trusted no one since Maggie's disappearance, and yet, something about the young Apache girl gnawed at him. Why was she doing this? Why had she chosen to help him? He could never fully trust her, yet he couldn't deny that he was relying on her to uncover the truth. As they reached a narrow ledge, Akacheta signaled for Maccabee to stop. She had found the entrance to the cave she had mentioned, hidden from the world. Inside, the air was damp and cool, a stark contrast to the brutal climb. They both took shelter from the elements, but as they settled down, Maccabee couldn't shake the feeling that the cave held more than just shelter, it held secrets. As the shadows deepened, Akacheta finally spoke, her voice low and reflective. She told McCabe about her past, a past she had never shared with anyone. She had once lived with her family on a peaceful Apache settlement, far from the violence that had torn their lives apart. When the colonizers came, they slaughtered everyone in their path. She had been taken in by the Apache warriors afterward, but her loyalty to them was not unquestionable. Her true allegiance was to her people, the ones lost in the flames of conquest. Akacheta's words struck McCabe with an intensity he hadn't expected. She spoke of loss, the kind of loss that transcended tribal lines. McCabe's heart ached as he realized the parallels between their lives. He had lost Maggie, just as she had lost everything. But what hurt him more was what came next. Akacheta's eyes met his with a look of grave seriousness as she told him that Maggie had not been killed by the Apaches, as he had feared. No, it was the colonizers who had murdered her, along with countless others. Maggie had been caught in the crossfire, part of a brutal massacre where no one was spared, neither settler nor native. Akacheta had tried to intervene, to save her, but the timing had been against them. She had failed, and Maggie's life was lost before they could act. The words hung heavily in the air, and McCabe's heart felt like it was being ripped out of his chest. He had come so far, believing that the Apaches were responsible for the death of his wife. And now, the truth was more painful than he could have imagined. The settlers, the very people McCabe had sworn to protect his land from, were the ones responsible. His quest for vengeance had been misdirected, his anger misplaced. A part of him wanted to scream, to let out the fury that built up inside him, but another part, a deeper part, felt a strange sense of relief. The mystery of Maggie's death had been solved, but at what cost? He had learned the truth, but it had shattered everything he thought he knew about right and wrong. The realization left him hollow, wondering what his next move should be. Just as McCabe was processing the weight of Akacheta's revelation, a distant sound reached his ears, the rhythmic pounding of hooves, getting closer with every passing second. He turned toward the entrance of the cave, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. Apache looked at him with wide eyes, her face pale. She had known this moment would come. "More settlers," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. McCabe's pulse quickened. He had barely survived the last encounter with these men, and now they were closing in once again. The truth was within his grasp, but so was his death. He wasn't sure which one would come first. A sense of dread washed over McCabe as the sound of the approaching riders grew louder. They were close, and with the cover of the cave providing little protection, they had nowhere to hide. Apache grabbed McCabe's arm, her grip firm yet desperate. "We need to move now," she urged, pulling him deeper into the cave. McCabe didn't hesitate. His heart was racing, but there was no time to waste. As they made their way further into the darkness, McCabe couldn't shake the thought that the settlers were only the beginning of a much bigger danger. They were close to uncovering the truth, but the path ahead was filled with even more peril than he could have imagined. With every step, the weight of the past seemed to bear down on him more heavily. The sound of hooves thundered through the clearing, and McCabe's heart sank as he realized they were surrounded. A group of colonial riders emerged from the trees, their faces hardened with years of conflict. They had been tracking him for days, and now they had him cornered. McCabe's grip tightened around his rifle, his mind racing for an escape route. Akachita Evercom stood beside him, her eyes scanning the riders with a calculating look. She didn't seem afraid. Instead, she was focused, poised for action. Without warning, she lunged at the nearest rider, her blade flashing in the dim light. The attack was swift and brutal, but Maccabee knew that this wouldn't be easy. The riders that had numbers, and they were coming at him from every direction. As the battle unfolded, Maccabee found himself caught in a deadly dance, exchanging fire with the colonial riders. Akachita moved like a shadow, striking with precision and speed, but even she couldn't avoid all of the blows. One rider managed to land a hit, and she staggered, a faint grimace crossing her face. McCabe's breath caught in his throat as he watched her fight through the pain. She was relentless, but the weight of their situation was beginning to show. For every rider she took down, two more appeared in the distance. The odds were stacked against them, and McCabe realized that their survival wasn't guaranteed. They felt the heat of vengeance building in him again, but he couldn't lose sight of the bigger picture. In the midst of the chaos, McCabe's eyes locked with the leader of the riders. The man was large, imposing, with a cruel smile that sent a chill down McCabe's spine. The leader's gaze seemed to mock him, as if the entire situation was nothing more than a game. McCabe's mind flashed to the moment when he had the rifle, aimed at the man's chest. He had the perfect shot, one clean pull of the trigger, and the leader would be dead. He could avenge Maggie's death, end the torment that had been haunting him for months. But as his finger hovered over the trigger, something inside him froze. For the first time, he questioned whether vengeance would truly bring him peace. His heart felt heavy, burdened by the weight of all the lives lost, including his wife's. He couldn't kill this man, not in cold blood. The truth was more complex than he had realized, and Maccabee wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. Still, breathing heavily from the fight, stepped forward, her eyes locked on Maccabee with an intensity that seemed to pierce through him. She asked him a simple question: "Are you truly ready to know the truth?" Her voice held no judgment, only curiosity. McCabe's mind reeled, torn between the desire for justice and the realization that this was no simple battle. The leader of the settlers, the man he had once seen as his enemy, was more than just a symbol of revenge. He was part of a much larger story, one that Maccabee wasn't yet ready to understand. The question lingered in the air as McCabe lowered his rifle, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. With the fight over, McCabe and Akechita stood among the fallen riders, the air thick with the smell of blood and gunpowder. Akechi's expression softened as she took a deep breath. Maggie wasn't just a victim of the settlers. She began, her voice heavy with the truth. She was a part of something bigger. She was working with a group of settlers who were trying to make peace with the Apaches, to protect your people from the violence that was coming. McCabe's mind reeled as he processed her words. Maggie had been involved with the very people he had been fighting against, but not as an enemy. She had tried to bridge the gap between the settlers and the Apaches, to stop the bloodshed before it spiraled out of control. Her death wasn't a betrayal. It was a tragic result of trying to protect both sides from a war that had already claimed too many lives. Akechita's revelation sent shockwaves through McCabe's mind. Maggie had risked everything to save both her people and the Apaches, and she had paid the ultimate price for it. The anger that had fueled him for so long began to drain from his body, replaced by a profound sense of loss and confusion. He had believed in a simple story. The settlers were the enemy, and the Apaches were the victims. But Maggie had seen beyond that. She had seen the possibility of peace. Even in the midst of war, McCabe realized that he had been blind to the complexities of the world around him, consumed by the need for revenge. He had sought closure, but what he had found was a deeper understanding of the cost of violence. As McCabe stood in silence, the weight of the truth pressing down on him, Akechita spoke again. "To understand everything, McCabe, you must go to the place where she was buried." Her words were slow, deliberate. The final piece of the puzzle is there. McCabe looked at her, uncertainty clouding his thoughts. He didn't want to face the past, didn't want to return to the place where it all began, but something deep within him told him that this was the only way forward. The leader of the settlers, the one he had spared, was more than just a survivor. He held the key to the last part of the story. McCabe wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew that the journey was far from over. He had come this far, and now he had to see it through to the end. Maccabee stood before the wounded leader, the man who had once been his enemy. The air between them was thick with tension, a lingering promise of death that never fully materialized. The leader, now on his knees, looked up at McCabe, his face etched with pain but also an unsettling calm. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," the man muttered, his voice hoarse. McCabe's hand tightened around his rifle, the old urge for vengeance stirring within him. But instead of raising the weapon, McCabe stepped closer. He had come to confront this man with the truth, to finally understand what had happened to Maggie. As he spoke, the leader's eyes flickered, with a mixture of guilt and resignation. "Your wife," he said, "was trying to broker a truce. She was working with us to find a way to stop the bloodshed, but she was caught between two worlds. She wasn't a traitor, she was trying to save everyone." The word struck McCabe like a thunderclap, the final blow to his vision of the world. As black and white, he had spent so many months consumed by the idea of revenge, the belief that the settlers were the ultimate evil. Now with this revelation, everything had shifted. Maggie wasn't the victim he had thought she was. She was a part of something greater, something beyond his hatred and bitterness. Her death wasn't a result of betrayal but a tragic consequence of two opposing forces colliding. McCabe felt the weight of those words sink deep into his chest, and for the first time since Maggie's death, he saw the world in shades of gray. His desire for revenge, once so fierce, now felt meaningless. The truth had liberated him in a way that vengeance never could. McCabe stood still, the rifle hanging loosely at his side, as the leader's words echoed in his mind. He had every right to kill this man to end the cycle of violence that had cost him his wife, his peace, and his purpose. But as he stood there, staring at the man who had once been his enemy, something inside him shifted. He realized that killing him would only prolong the hatred, trapping him in the same cycle of violence that had taken so much already. He could no longer let his grief control him. Akecheta's presence beside him, her silent support, reminded him of the journey he had been on, not just to find Maggie, but to find peace within himself. He knew that the real battle wasn't with the settlers or the Apaches, it was within him. And in that moment, McCabe chose to step away from vengeance. He chose forgiveness. The leader, sensing the change in McCabe, looked up at him with weary eyes. There was no more fight left in him, no more will to resist. "You'll never understand the cost of this war," he whispered, "but you have the chance to end it. Don't let your pain blind you to the truth." McCabe nodded, understanding the weight of those words more than he ever had. His journey had started with rage, but now it had come to an end with the acceptance of what had happened and the understanding that he couldn't change the past. He glanced at Akecheta, who stood a few steps away, her gaze steady and knowing. In her silence, she was telling him everything he needed to hear. He had made the right choice, and now it was time to let go. With a heavy heart, McCabe walked to Maggie's grave, the final resting place of the woman he had loved and lost. He knelt beside it, his hands trembling as he placed a simple wooden cross on the mound of earth. It wasn't much, but it was the only thing he could give her now. As he stood up, his eyes lingered on the grave for a moment longer, and then he turned to face Akecheta. She approached him, her expression solemn yet filled with understanding. She told him that her journey with him had come to an end, that she had fulfilled her part in guiding him toward the truth. But before she left, she offered him one last piece of wisdom. The only way to move forward is to forgive. McCabe looked at her, his heart full of gratitude, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. Akecheta began to walk away, her small frame disappearing into the distance, her silhouette framed by the setting sun. McCabe watched her go, feeling a strange sense of closure. She had come into his life like a force of nature, guiding him through the darkness, helping him find the light of truth and forgiveness. Now she was returning to her people, to her own path. McCabe stood there for a long while, the weight of everything he had learned settling within him. He had come to this place seeking vengeance, but in the end, he had found something far more valuable: peace. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the land, and for the first time in months, McCabe felt like he could finally breathe. The journey was over, but the legacy of forgiveness was just beginning. As McCabe turned to leave, his mind no longer consumed by anger or the need for answers, he felt a new sense of purpose. He had learned that vengeance could never heal the wounds of the past, that only forgiveness could break the chains of hatred and allow one to move forward. The path ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in a long while, McCabe felt ready to face whatever came next. The mountain of grief had been climbed, and now, as the night fell around him, he knew that the legacy he would carry forward wasn't one of revenge, but one of peace. With a final glance at the setting sun, McCabe walked away from the grave, his heart lighter than it had ever been.